Once upon a time, a girl took a bite from an apple, and we've been trying to digest it ever since.
Six.
In America today, we are preoccupied with sex. But we didn't invent lustiness or premarital sex. They're a part of our American heritage. Haven't heard of this? Good. You'll want to watch our show. Textbooks and schools on the whole ignore sex in American history. Students are taught Americans make treaties, go to war, write books, and play politics. But it's rarely mentioned that they had sex. To rectify things, we've come up with our own textbook to show you just how your high school history might have been taught if teachers had included the forbidden subject. It would begin, as many textbooks do, with the Pilgrims. But we'd skip over Plymouth Rock to talk about a place that textbooks wholly ignore, Marymount. This was a little community of lusty, carefree, do-what-you-want hippies who spent their days drinking and dancing around a so-called maypole planted in the center of the settlement. Located just a few miles from Plymouth, Marymount was, in many ways, the Pilgrim colony's worst nightmare. It was pagan, promiscuous, and prosperous.
It's something that the Puritans found offensive in many levels.
James Baker is the official historian of Plymouth Plantation.
Part of it was the licentiousness of it, part of it was the non-Christianity of it, and part of it simply was that they found it the worst competitor they could get.
Predictably, given the Pilgrims' hostility, the settlement came to a bad end. In 1636, the Pilgrims sent in Miles Standish to pull down the maypole and run off the leader, fur trader Thomas Morton. Today, all we ever hear about are the Pilgrims. They're the ones who've got the big memorial the tourist crowd around. This is the only official reminder of Marymount's existence, a small marker on the side of the road in a quiet neighborhood in Quincy, Massachusetts. And not one tourist. Next in our history come the Puritans. They can't really be said to have shown much lustiness, but it can now be asserted without contradiction that the Puritans were human and had sex.
Some boys think they can take advantage of you if you date them more than a couple of times.
Legal records show that fornication outside marriage was fairly common among the Puritans. They don't mention this in school, but Puritans had children out of wedlock so often that the authorities quite early on had to set up a special system to force the fathers to pay child support. But more about the Puritans later in this show. For it's time for Chapter 3, time to read about the curious story of Lord Cornbury, the colonial governor of New York and New Jersey between 1702 and 1708. By reputation, Cornbury was America's first transvestite. According to his enemies, he used to dress up in drag at colonial social functions in order, it was said, to show off his striking resemblance to his cousin, Queen Anne. The New York Historical Society flatly says this person in drag is a painting of Lord Cornbury and prominently displays the painting in the central corridor to help drag in the tourists. But the picture's authenticity has been questioned, and it may be his enemies just made up the story of transvestism to drive him off. But it's interesting that people made the charge even if it wasn't true. At the very least, it shows that transvestism isn't exactly new. Chapter 4 is where students learn about the revolution. Not the political revolution, the sexual revolution, the first one. In the normal textbooks, all you ever hear is how Americans in the Age of Reason discovered liberty.
Give me liberty, or give me death.
But they also seem to have come to a revolutionary new understanding of sex, breaking long sacred social taboos, along with their ties with Britain, which has led some historians to dub the Age of Reason the Age of Sex. Recent research shows that in places like Concord, Massachusetts, and Bristol, Rhode Island, People who expected to be married engaged in premarital sex with their intended spouses on an unprecedented scale. On the eve of the revolution in Bristol, 1 out of every 2 babies was conceived out of wedlock. Of the founding fathers, one in particular was in the forefront of this sexual revolution, Benjamin Franklin. The textbooks have seen to it that we think of Franklin as the innovative scientist who experimented with politics along with electricity.
There, that's all we have.
But he was actually a promiscuous man, a notorious womanizer. In a letter, he advised his son on the selection of lovers, telling him to go after older women because they would be more appreciative of the attention than the younger ones. In Chapter 5, students would find out about the Victorians. As it happens, the Victorians were by and large as stuffy, prim, and proper as they've been made out to be. Women especially were held to ridiculously stern standards of do's and don'ts. Don't refer to the leg of a piano, call it a limb. Don't say you got into bed, say you composed yourself to sleep. But even Victorians didn't all march in moral lockstep. Prostitution flourished among the Victorians. Out on the frontier, the whorehouse became an established institution. In New York City, so many tens of thousands of prostitutes plied their trade that guidebooks were actually published listing their addresses, though the books included a characteristically Victorian disclaimer. In Boston, so many single women became pregnant that reformers opened a network of houses to accommodate them all, including the Crittenden Hastings House, still in existence. Elizabeth Rylanger runs the house today.
People think that unwed motherhood is a phenomena of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the liberal society that we live in. But the reality is the Crittenden Hastings House was founded in response to the incidence of unwed motherhood, primarily among rural and immigrant women who had come into the urban areas in order to get employment and found themselves pregnant out of wedlock.
Most Victorian women didn't have children until they married, of course, but hundreds of thousands were so intrigued by sex that they avidly read marriage manuals that told them how to achieve an orgasm. Frederick Hollick's manual, a bestseller, explained that when intercourse is performed properly, quote, both beings are thrown into a species of mental ecstasy and bodily fever, during which all other thoughts and functions are totally suspended, and all the vital forces are concentrated in the reproductive system. And then there's the sex survey, which was invented by Victorians in the 1890s.
How many times do you have intercourse with your husband?
The very first one, compiled by a Stanford University female doctor, asked,
Have you ever had an orgasm? How many times? When?
The questionnaire was discovered recently by Stanford historian Carl Degler.
When these were middle-class women, so we're talking here about the very people that we often thought were uninterested in sex, did not talk about it, did not think about it.
The chapter on the Victorians would conclude with the story of Victoria Woodhull, a real shocker. A candidate for president, fighter for women's suffrage, Woodhull went around the country lecturing about free love.
She would give these public lectures to hundreds of people, many of whom were women, most of whom were women, in fact. And yet here were these Victorian women who are supposed to be so restricted and so restrained, actually coming out and paying money.
What were some of the things that she would say that would be shocking in these lectures?
Well, one of them would be that she didn't think that marriage was necessary for sexual relations. That I would, if I felt like loving a man, I would do so.
And this is in the middle of the 19th century, high tide of Victorianism.
Right.
In Chapter 6, the history would suddenly become very familiar, the Roaring Twenties, for this is where the standard textbooks suddenly discovered that Americans have sex. Why did the textbooks include sex in the 1920s and not earlier? Well, it's because they've been influenced by pop culture. Pop movies and books have given us a lasting impression that sex was a vital element of life in the 1920s. If the textbooks omitted sex, the accounts of the period would strike almost everybody as blatantly false. Well, that's a glimpse of what your high school history textbook might have included. Now you know what you missed. And we didn't even mention the presidential sex scandals. They're next. It was one of the most sensational events of the 1990s.
I have dealt with my hurt for 2 years now, so this is nothing new to me.
Jennifer Flowers accusing the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, of adultery. Never before had anyone held a news conference to level a charge like this. But charges of this type are hardly rare in American history. In fact, they're an American tradition. In school, of course, they don't teach students about the history of sex. So kids pick up information about politicians' sex lives the way they do about sex itself. Helter-skelter. Leaving them prey to misinformation peddled by movie makers, government bureaucrats, and pressure groups. So we'll set the record straight, beginning with Alexander Hamilton. Ow! In the gay press, it's often alleged that Alexander Hamilton was a homosexual because during the Revolution, he wrote suggestive letters to a friend of his, John Laurens.
I wish, my dear Laurens, it might be in my power by action rather than words to convince you that I love you. I shall only tell you that till you bade us adieu, I hardly knew the value you had taught my heart to set upon you. Alexander Hamilton.
But there's no evidence Hamilton was gay. In the 18th century, it was common for men to exchange romantic letters. Hamilton was involved in a sex scandal. When he was Secretary of the Treasury, he carried on an affair with a woman named Mrs. Reynolds. He himself made it known when her husband tried to blackmail him. Moviegoers who went to see the film Jefferson in Paris were left with the impression Jefferson had a long-running affair with Sally Hemings, a black slave he took with him when he went to Europe. But did he? The unsatisfying answer is, nobody knows. The charge was first leveled against Jefferson when he was president by an unsavory journalist who'd been turned down for a job. Jefferson denied the allegation, but gave his enemies plenty of reason for thinking it was true. He subsequently freed Sally's children and no others. And it is a curious fact that Sally was related to Jefferson's late wife, Martha. They were half-sisters. Both had the same father, slave owner John Wales, and they looked similar. But so what? Henry Graff has taught at Columbia University about the presidency for decades. But the Sally Hemings story, do you credit it at all, or?
I read what everybody else reads. And there will be two sides to that, I think, for a long,
You're the foremost historian of the presidency in America.
I wasn't present. I wasn't present.
You're sure you like to do things like that?
Sure.
Franklin Roosevelt is commonly thought to have had several affairs. And he did. When he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Wilson administration, he had an affair with his wife's secretary, Lucy Mercer. While he was president, he had an affair with Missy LeHan, his secretary. He left half his estate to her. She lived in the White House in a room near his. It was a crowded White House. Down the hall from Missy LeHan lived lesbian Lorena Hickok, Eleanor's friend. Lorena and Eleanor penned 3,000 letters to each other, many seemingly love letters. In one, Eleanor wrote, "I want to put my arms around you and kiss you at the corner of your mouth. And in little more than a week now, I shall." But were they lesbian lovers? No one knows.
1915, I mean, that was the end of the house.
But what's interesting is that at Hyde Park, FDR's home in upstate New York, the government guides pretend that Franklin and Eleanor were happily married.
And this would have been the master bedroom in the house, I believe.
They know the truth, but they keep it a secret. Why don't the guides talk honestly about the Roosevelt sexual history? Because the place is run by the government, the National Park Service, and the government can never be trusted to tell the truth about history. Too many pressure groups with lots of clout have to be accommodated. Family descendants, super patriotic organizations, political parties, grade schools, what have you. Virtually all the pressure is on the government to lie. Hardly anybody presses the bureaucrats to tell the truth, and so they don't.
John F. Kennedy's young family image was enhanced by Jacqueline's pregnancy and Caroline's charm.
John Kennedy is now well known for his numerous amorous adventures.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
But at the Kennedy Museum in Boston, run by the government, the officials pretend he was the perfect husband.
So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby.
Actually, Kennedy had so many affairs going that national security was genuinely put in jeopardy sometimes. A fact brought to light by biographer Thomas Reeves.
There are moments in the Kennedy story when he's running around, for example, with a couple of Secret Service men and flashlights in tunnels underneath hotels in New York City, trying to get to the next woman. We know at least in one case, they lost track of the man who's supposed to be in his presence with the secret nuclear codes. It's a scary scenario.
But of course, at the Kennedy Museum, officials don't breathe a peep about any of this.
Well, of course not. The Kennedy Library is an embarrassment to historians, and they are presenting Kennedy the hero. No other presidential library is as unashamed.
Just talking about presidents and sex makes some people uncomfortable, and no wonder. As everybody knows, our culture was shaped decisively centuries ago by that contemptible band of prudes, the Puritans.
Hester Prynne, it is now ordered that you shall wear the scarlet letter A.
A wise sentence. He will be a living sermon against sin.
Do you know what this means?
Adultery.
But what was the world of the Puritans really like? To find out, we decided to take you to Pioneer Village in Salem, Massachusetts, one of those living history museums. Clearly, this wasn't a place where people were running around having lots of fun. Who could afford to? Life was hard. This dwelling, known as a dugout, was home to up to 10 people. But they drank beer and wine, wore stylish clothes, and, believe it or not, engaged enthusiastically in sex. Dean Lampros is the village's official historian.
They enjoyed sex, actually. They, I think, had some very healthy attitudes towards sex.
We have been taught, of course, to believe that the Puritans were singularly anti-sex. But compared to most Europeans, they held rather advanced views on the subject.
By the standards of their day, they were considered fairly radical because they were beginning to break with this idea that sex was for procreation only, and they didn't see it that way.
There must be heart purity in regard of heaven.
Still having trouble that the Puritans approved of sex? Consider this. When the congregation of the First Church of Boston found out that one of its members, James Maddock, had refused to sleep with his wife for 2 years running, they not only condemned him, they threw him out of the congregation. Puritans believed that sex was not only a vital part of life, but also of marriage.
I recently heard a story of a married couple who immediately upon marriage agreed to live apart from each other without ever approaching the nuptial bed. The use of the marriage bed is founded in man's nature, and any withdrawal from it on the part of the husband or of the wife denies all relief in wedlock and unto human necessity, and sends it for supply unto adultery, when God gives not the gift of faithfulness.
So why do we stigmatize the Puritans the way that we do? Well, they did make some women wear the scarlet letter A. They did put a couple of adulterers to death, and they regularly did whip fornicators. So they were firmly on record against sex outside marriage. But the chief reason is they are convenient scapegoats. We've wanted to blame somebody for our supposedly repressive cultural taboos, so we blame the Puritans. The decisive event in this history of blame was World War I. The war had seemed so meaningless. Hundreds of thousands of young men going to their deaths in battles that lasted months for territorial gains measured in mere inches. The people began questioning the conventional moral foundations of Western civilization. In truth, it wasn't the Puritans who were anti-sex, it was the Victorians.
One of my pet peeves is that we're always going around talking about Puritanism and being a Puritan and being therefore against pleasure, when we all really talk about Victorianism, and it's the Victorians who are the ones that we're trying to repress.
So the next time you hear somebody lambasting the Puritans for our sexual hang-ups, set them to rights. It's the Victorians who are to blame.
We never talked about it. But then we've dated regularly for quite a while.
The Victorians may be to blame not only for our sexual hang-ups, but also for our ignorance of our sexual history. Until recently, Victorian blinders stopped historians from even addressing the subject. But there may be another reason we don't know much. Fact is, much of our sexual history is secret. It's taken real detective work for historians to uncover what little they know. Take Horatio Alger, the author of a shelf full of 19th century novels featuring young boys who, through pluck and luck, raise themselves up by their bootstraps. To generations of Americans, Alger was the voice of rags to riches success. Then in the 1970s, scholars discovered that Alger, who'd started out in life as a pastor at a Unitarian church in Brewster, Massachusetts, had a deep, dark secret. Digging in old church records that wound up at the Harvard Divinity School, they found out that he had been exposed as a child molester and forced to give up his church position and flee town. But the truth was buried in those records. Most of us today are prepared to believe that people have secret lives. Daily experience teaches us that what's visible is often a mask, what is hidden is often real. So when we hear some sensational story, we're inclined to believe it. But you can't always.
Oh, you're catching on very fast.
This book, a biography written in the 1920s, long before Alger's pederasty was known, claimed that Alger was a swinging heterosexual bachelor who had an affair with a floozy in Paris and a menage a trois with 2 sisters in Cincinnati. It wasn't true. The biographer later confessed the book was a complete fabrication. Any word of truth in it got in unwittingly. But for 50 years, the book was considered the standard life of Horatio Alger, cited even by the eminent Harvard Guide to American History. The moral of this seems to be, we're often inclined to believe the worst of people.
Now you see, Meg, I'm a writer. And I write about girls who are in love.
Little Women is the perennial Victorian classic by novelist Louisa May Alcott. Nothing scurrilous about Alcott, but she too had a secret that scholars had to dig up.
Well, Leona really made the original discovery about...
Leona Rostenberg and her friend Madeline Stern were studying Alcott's writings in 1942 when Leona happened upon a heretofore unexamined letter. It was at Harvard's Houghton Library, where Alcott's correspondence is kept.
I began to examine some of the material, and I might add that complete silence prevailed in Houghton manuscript room. Not even a typewriter clattered.
The letter indicated that Alcott had been writing books under a pseudonym, A.M. Barnard.
Well, I could not believe my eyes. Here it all was. I let out a wild whoop that broke the silence.
What Leona had discovered was that Alcott had a double life, writing standard Victorian novels under her own name and scandalous ones under the pseudonym.
We know of Louisa May Alcott as the children's friend, the author of Little Women. Lovely, lovely stories for children.
Little girls like you prefer a happy story.
Now she's writing about drug addiction, transvestites, especially the sexual power struggle between men and women.
Leona and Madeline have had 50 years to get used to the idea that Louisa May Alcott had a secret life. They still can't get over it. Well, that's our show. It's not history the way it's usually taught in school, but it is history, and useful history at that. For it helps to remind us that history is about human beings, something a lot of teachers seem to forget. That's no myth. I'm Rick Shenkman.